So now let's move on to the policy responses to recessions and booms. And I'm going to stick with recessions on this because that's really the one that we want to talk about. I mean, a boom, generally people like that, right? And then if the aggregate demand curve will self-correct, well, sometimes a good policy is no policy at all, right? Let the aggregate demand curve self-correct, sure. But if there is a recession, on the other hand, in the short run, you may not want to wait for that aggregate demand curve to go back to long-run potential output. So what you may want to do is you may want to use fiscal policy to target a different aggregate demand position. So again, we're working with inflation gap and output gap, and fiscal policy would operate through that velocity of money indicator here on the monetary side of the Fisher equation. And there are two main fiscal policies. The first one is deficits. The second one is regulation. Now, usually you'll hear the first one is taxing, the second one is spending, but really taxing and spending are two sides of the same coin. A fiscal policy becomes effective when it increases the deficit or decreases the deficit if you're going for a contraction. And then regulation is often ignored, but I do want to include that because that can have effects on the macroeconomic policy, especially if it's a sweeping federal regulation. So, expansionary fiscal policy is any federal government tax or spending plan that increases deficits. So a tax cut on the side of, say, typically we talk about tax cuts and the Republican Party. A tax cut, if it increases deficits, would have the same effect in the Keynesian model as an increase in government spending. So if we look at the Democrats and the Republicans, Democrats known for increasing spending, Republicans known for decreasing taxes. Really, from a Keynesian perspective, it's the same thing because so long as they both increase that deficit, it's a fiscal stimulus. If it decreases that deficit, then it's a fiscal contraction. Contractionary fiscal policy, any federal government tax or spending plan that decreases deficits. We can see that in more of the austerity measures, for example, that say the International Monetary Fund would encourage for those countries that are facing high inflation rates. So, all right, let's go ahead and move on to the next one, or to the next slide here. So I'll have deficits indicated by this curvy delta here. What we have then is, an increase in government spending would come in terms of that delta G, or say a decrease in taxes on consumers and firms, that growth rate of investment and consumptions where that would come in. We could go to, say, a reduction in tariffs. Either way, that would increase that velocity of money, pushing that aggregate demand curve out, whereas a decrease in deficits would then have the other effect on that y equals c plus i plus g equation. All right, so moving on to regulation. Regulation is any law or rule that would decrease the growth of output. Deregulation, any law or rule or repeal of a law or rule that increases the growth of output here. So this is coming in from a different side of things, not necessarily a taxing or spending side, but more a regulatory angle across the economy. Now, again, this is all looking at, we're all looking at in terms of output and inflation. Obviously, you'd want, some regulation for other goals, but this is just that regulatory effect on inflation and output. So let's say we have this decrease in regulation or a deregulation. We'd end up with, say, maybe firms buying more goods and services for production, households consuming more, that velocity of money going up and therefore pushing out that inflation gap and output gap. And the same with, the opposite direction, increased regulation. So here I have my typos there. I want my up arrow. Here we have that increasing regulation, which would then be decreasing that velocity of money and pushing that inflation gap and output gap down. So let's consider the deficit spending approach. And I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this slide here, push him down. And what would that look like? Well, let's say we have in 2016, maybe not necessarily a recession, but a decrease in aggregate demand that pushes that curve down. I wonder, can I make him a different color? Maybe an orange. There we go. So our aggregate demand curve has decreased, leading to some decrease in the inflation gap, decrease in the output gap. So the fiscal policy response of, say, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act What that would then do is then, through that velocity of money, push that aggregate demand curve back out. And let's say we overshoot it with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and we get a resulting higher than expected inflation rate and a higher than expected output. So that is how this mechanism would work under a Keynesian perspective of the ASAD model. We have a bit of a jump in inflation and a bit of a jump in output, as we saw in the wake of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And that is fiscal policy, which you can predict very easily. We generally see these things coming down the pipeline long before they're passed into law, so you have a lot of time to deal with that. Now, this increase in inflation, though, the Federal Reserve may look at that, and the chairman, Jay Powell, may look at that and say, ooh, that inflation is actually a little higher than I wanted. The Federal Reserve may act. How would they react to this? How would the Federal Reserve interplay with the federal government? How would they respond to this rising inflation? And that's something that we'll discuss in the monetary policy aspect of this. But fiscal policy is fairly straightforward. I think most people have a good understanding of taxing and spending with deficits, but they do need to keep in mind that regulations can also have this effect on aggregate demand, leading to potential stimulus or contractionary pressures.